to this video. Today we'll be looking at the increment and the decrement operators in C++ or programming in general. So when we talk about the increment and the decrement operators, they are shorthands we can use to increase a value by 1 or decrease a value by 1 respectively. So I'm very sure you've seen things like x plus plus x, x minus 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 x. I'm quite sure you've seen something like this before. And these are basically adding 1 to a variable or taking away 1 from a variable. With this tool, you can see some difference where the operators come after the variable name and where the operators come before the variable name. Right, so we have what we call the postfix. So the postfix is where the operators come after the variable name. So we can have x plus plus, x minus minus as our postfix increment and decrement operators. And when it comes to the prefix, we can have plus plus x and minus minus x. Right, so these are basically our increment operators. Right, so what difference do we have in postfix mode and prefix mode? When it comes to postfix mode, values are added to a variable after they have been used. All right, so after a variable is used, the compiler adds a value, adds 1 to the variable or subtracts 1 from the variable. But when it comes to prefix, 1 is added to the variable or subtracted from the variable before it is used by the compiler. Alright, so we will dive into some examples here and see how this basically works. So on the normal, you can create a variable, and if you want to add 1 to a variable, you can simply do, we call our variable equals our variable plus 1. So we can initialize this to 0. Right, so when we have int num equals 0, num equals num plus 1, we are basically saying that our num variable is taking a value 0. And then when we come down here, we are going to have 0 plus 1. And this will be assigned to our num variable. So basically, if you want to add 1 to a variable, this is how you go about it. Right, but then there comes in the increment operator, which makes things quite simpler. You can do num plus plus, and it's basically the same thing. But what num plus is doing is going to make use of the value in num first before it adds the 1 to the variable, or it increases the value by 1. Right, same thing for the decrement. You can do int x equals 0. Then you can say num equals num minus 1. This is going to take away 1 from the variable x. So if we make this 2, we are going to have, we are using x now. Yes, so we are going to have 2 minus 1, which is going to output 1. Assign 1 to our variable x. Or if you don't want to do this, you can come to the next line and simply do x plus plus, and it's going to do the same work for you. Right, so we've got a couple of examples we can go through to understand how these postfix and prefix actually work under the hood. So I'm going to clear this. right? And I'll declare a variable num, assign a value of 4 to it, and then we are going to display this value to our user. So let's say the variable num is num, and this is simply going to output the value of num to our user. So let's do a comment here and then display the value of num. Right, so when we run this, we expect to see the variable num is 4. Right, so now let's increase the value by 1 using the increment operator, specifically postfix. So we can print a message to our user and say, I will now increment num. Then we can do new lines and then using the postfix, right? Using the postfix increment. We can do num plus plus, and this here is going to add 1 to our variable here. So on our next line, we expect to have this value increase by 1. So the variable num is now going to be we can output this and we expect this to be 5. Right, so the first output was displaying the value of what we assigned to num initially, and then our second thing is incrementing this variable num by 1 using the postfix method. So we have this. Then we can again increment it using the prefix plus plus to increment num, right? So we say I will now increment num again. All right. So let's do this. Using the prefix, we are going to have plus plus the variable name. All right, so then we can output that. So the variable num is now going to be, if you get it by now, you would realize that this is going to increase from 5 to 6. Right, so we have 6 here. Then we can do the decrement operator. So I will now decrement. I'll now decrement num. Then let's add some new lines, and then let's say num minus minus. Then we can print this to our console. So variable num is we expect this to decrease. So from 6 to 5. Then we can run this and see our output. So we get to decrease the value from 6 to 5. Let's end this. And then again, we are going to Alright, so we can put a comment here, say using the postfix decrement to decrement num, then using the prefix to decrement num. We can do minus minus num, then we can see out Alright, so now we expect to decrease num from 5 to 6, right? So let's run this, and we expect our last value to be, alright, it's 4, it was 6 here from our last increment, so we decrease it using postfix, and then again another decrement using the prefix. Right, this looks very simple from here, but this can be quite confusing. So you'll be looking at another example where this is going to be a little bit something to think about before you get it right. So let's create a new project. Then give it a name. We can open the project, and then we can dive right into our example. Right, so now again we are going to create our num variable and assign a value of 4 to it again. And this time around we can simply output num, and then we expect to see 4 because we are not incrementing or decrementing the variable here. We are just showing this in our console. Alright, so then again we can do cout num plus plus. Alright, and this here is going to be something very interesting. So we run our code. First thing we expect to see for our first line is 4, right? Then again we come here, and down here 2 things are happening. If you realize that, first thing is going to be outputting the variable num, and then the second thing is incrementing the value by 1. Then again we get to know that this is postfix. So the value is first going to be printed to the console before 1 is added to our variable. So when we run this, we expect to see this in memory is 4 before we add this. But then before we add this, we are going to output this to the string. So on this line, we expect to see 4. Alright. So let's run it and see what we get. So we have 4 and 4. Can be a bit confusing, but let's try this and see how this is actually working. So now let's do cout num and line. Right, So on this line, let's run it first and see what is going on. End line. Right, so let's run this and see. So we see 4, 4, 5. So why do we get 4, 4, 5? First, the variable was initialized to 4. So by default, we are going to see 4, right? Then on this line, we output the value in memory first before we increment it by 1. So by displaying the value first, in memory it is still 4, right? That's why we get to see 4 here. Then the next thing it does is increase it by 1. So then it stores 5 to this variable in memory. So down here, this thing gets to see 5 and not 4. That is how we get our 5 here. Right, so we can continue with our prefix increment and do plus plus num. Right, so what do you expect us to get here? This time around, we are not going to get the same 5. Two things are happening here. We have a prefix increment, which is going to increase the value first in memory before it outputs the value. So from here, our output was 5. So down here, we come here and we increase the value by 1, which is going to give us 6 before we output this to the console. So let's run this and we expect to see 4, 4, 5, 6. Exactly. Right, so we should be able to get this by now. Alright, we can still do cout num, and the value doesn't have to change. We still get to see num. 6, right? The value doesn't change. So then again, we can try looking at postfix decrement, where we can do minus minus and then end line. So then again, our output here is still 6. We come here and this is going to be outputted first before the value is decreased. So we still expect to see 6 here. So let's run this and our last output should be 6. Yes, so we have 6, 6, 6 here. And that is exactly what we expect. So cout, we can do num, right? And this time around, because we had the postfix decrement, this thing has now been decreased by 1 in memory. So we expect to see this line printing out 5. So let's run this. And then we get to see our last value is 5. Then the last thing we can try is the prefix decrement, where we have minus minus our variable name. We can do end line and we expect to see 4 because this is being decreased in memory before we can output it, right? So let's run this and we expect to see the value 4, right? Exactly as we have it here. So this is all about increment and decrement operators in C++. It also applies to other programming languages. So if you understand it here, you can apply it to a lot of programming languages, right? So this will be the end of this video. In our next video, we will be tackling some examples of how we can apply this in our daily coding activities. Right, so I'll see you in the next video. Bye.